As far as possible, you want to ensure that the information entered into your system is as accurate as possible. You use a technique called data validation to control the type of data or the values that users enter when they're putting information into a cell or a range of cells. For example, you may want to restrict data entry to a certain range of dates, limit choices by using a list, or make sure that only positive whole numbers are entered into the cells. In this lecture, we're going to briefly explore how data validation works in Excel and the different data validation techniques available to you. Data validation is an Excel feature that you can use to define restrictions on what data can or should be entered into a cell. You can configure data validation to prevent users from entering data that is not valid. If you prefer, you can allow users to enter invalid data but warn them when they try to type it into the cell. You can also provide messages to define what input you expect for the cell and instructions to help users correct any errors. The objective is to ensure that, as far as possible, the data entered into your system is as accurate as possible. For example, in the Helpless Airlines application, you could set up the age cell to allow only for a specific range of ages between 1 and 90. If a user enters an age above that range, you could have a policy of telling them that they will require medical certification to fly. You do this by going to the Data ribbon and selecting Data Validation. The validation rules will be applied to the currently selected cell or range of cells. There are a range of options available here, but let's illustrate it by reference to the age cells. First, we need to select the cells. Now we go to the Data Validation dialog box. This has 3 tabs and we will look at each one. So in the Settings tab, when you select the pull-down menu, you're given a choice as to what type of data you wish to restrict the cell range to. In this case, we will select whole numbers. The Data pull-down menu gives you a set of Boolean operators to choose from. We will specify between 1 and 90. This will include both numbers and all whole numbers in between. Now we can select the Input Message tab and set up an appropriate input message to help the user understand what they should enter. Give the message a title, age range. And now let's put an enter a whole number between 1 and 90 as the message that the user sees when they select any of the cells. Next, we need to put in an appropriate message which will appear when the user attempts to enter invalid data. So select the Error Alert tab and notice that we have 3 styles of message to choose from. We can either stop the user entering the data, we can warn them that the data is invalid. In this case, we get a message, but are given the choice as to whether they wish to allow the data to be entered. And finally, we can provide an information statement, but allow the data to be entered in any event. In our case, we will put a stop message and disallow a user from entering invalid ages. A very useful option which you can use for data validation is to restrict data to predefined items in a list. For example, you could limit the row selection options in Helpless Airlines to rows 13, 23 and 37 by selecting List from the Settings tab and typing in the values separated by a comma. You will now see that a pull-down menu is available on the cell with this validation type, and the user simply selects a valid value. Make sure that the in-cell drop-down checkbox is selected, otherwise you won't be able to see the drop-down arrow next to the cell. You should experiment with the other options and see how they work. Be aware that there are a few issues with the validation options. Input messages and error alerts appear only when data is typed directly into the cells. They do not appear when the user enters data in the cell by copying or filling. If you plan to protect the workbook, you should do so after you have finished specifying any validation settings. You can apply data validation to cells that already have data entered in them. However, Excel does not automatically notify you that the existing cells contain invalid data. To quickly remove data validation from a cell, select it and then open the Data Validation dialog box. On the Settings tab, click Clear All. To find the cells on a workbook that have data validation, go to the Home tab. In the Editing group, click Find and Select, and then click Data Validation. After you have found the cells that have data validation, you can change, copy, or remove validation settings. This lecture has been just an introduction to using the validation features in Excel. In future courses, I intend to develop a more comprehensive explanation of all of the options available, their restrictions, and their advantages.